Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here talking to you today, starting the day in this lovely venue. So I work for Nielsen BookScan. Our core business is still measuring print book sales around the world. So today I'm going to be talking about the data we've got from our core existing businesses, which is measuring those print book sales, but also talking about some of the data we're seeing on ebook sales and connected device adoption in some of those territories. So, first of all, I'm going to be talking about some of the context of the international book market. So that'll be looking at a global consumer confidence survey that Nielsen do and the data we have from international print book markets. I'm then going to talk a little about connected devices adoption, which is e-readers and tablets, and the kind of market penetration we're seeing in the US and in Italy. Then I'm going to move on to talk about specifically the UK ebook market, where we have consumer data, which is helping us to identify the trends that are developing through the UK market. Now, one of the first points to make is that, as I mentioned, our core business is measuring print book sales, and as yet, there's not a broad and consistent measure of ebook sales that we have access to. So to kind of fill that gap and give us some insight into the developing market, we're using consumer data. So, first of all, as a business which is reliant on consumers and the retail market to a degree, consumer confidence is key to really how those markets are going to perform. Nielsen carry out a very broad global survey of consumers' attitudes to their own finances and the economy of the country they live in. So it's not linked to any abstract economic figures or measures. It's really about consumers' opinions about their own finances and how they're going to be spending their money in the year ahead. Based on that, countries are given a score, with 100 being a neutral level of confidence. Above 100 would be positive, optimism and a good consumer outlook, and below 100 shows a kind of pessimism within the market and a relatively negative consumer outlook. We can see here on the kind of global wheel of confidence that at the very top we've got India, who are really in the positive at over 120 in terms of their score. Right down the bottom we have Greece. If I just move on to show this is the markets that Nielsen BookScan is measuring, we can see that most of those markets are under 100 and also under the global average. India right at the top again. Brazil showing good positive consumer confidence, and that's a market we're going to be starting to measure later this year. We have Australia and New Zealand that are above the average, coming down through the US and Great Britain somewhere in the middle. Italy, sadly, quite far down, showing quite a negative picture there in terms of overall consumer confidence. Obviously, we link these things generally to the sort of overall economic situation. Also, things like political factors and potential instability will affect people's outlook for the consumer confidence. So we measure 9 territories worldwide at the moment, and last year that represented over 1 billion book sales in terms of print book sales that we measured across those 9 markets. Perhaps unsurprisingly, having just seen the consumer confidence for those markets, all but one of them saw negative growth in their book markets last year. This is all still print book sales, not taking ebooks into account. So all of the countries there in the red, with the exception of India, which saw positive growth around about 16% in their book market. It's a rapidly developing market, partly because a lot of the economy and the book market has been a kind of what you might call a grey economy, or a kind of books sold by street markets rather than official retail chains. Those retail chains are now growing and developing, and the book market that we're measuring is growing as well. In terms of the other countries, UK saw the slightest decline at just over 3%. Italy, in the middle somewhere of our territories, at around about 7% decline year on year. The question mark we have now will be what we see in the Brazilian market that we're measuring. We're hoping to launch that service in the second half of this year. We would expect to see a rapidly developing and growing book market there. There's obviously broad social factors to do with increasing urbanisation and development, the raising of literacy levels through government directives, and all of those things that are going to increase literacy and lead to wider book reading and obviously wider book sales. One story I read recently about the government directive from the Brazilian government for every school within the country to have a library by the year 2020. And as so many schools at the moment don't have a library, that's equivalent to building about 40 libraries every day between now and 2020 for Brazil's schools to become compliant with that government directive. So that's another kind of measure of how quickly that market's going to develop. Another consistent trend that we've seen across many of our print book markets that we're measuring internationally, if we look at the very broad sectors in the market, fiction, non-fiction, and the children's sector, it's actually the non-fiction sector, which is the largest in most markets, which has declined the most year on year. So the orange bars here, you can see, are the most into the negative side of the graph. So in terms of print book markets, we're seeing negative growth, although areas for development in emerging markets such as Brazil and India. Existing markets, we're seeing this decline. Obviously, we link that to the economic situation and general economic malaise. And also, an element here is that we're only measuring print books, and the slightly unknown quantity is how much of the market has moved over to ebooks. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later, and I'm sure that other people later today will as well. Sorry. Okay, moving on to look at connected devices, which covers primarily of interest to people in publishing, covers tablets and e-readers. We have consumer data from the US and from Italy showing the market penetration of those devices, which I can share with you now. So within the US, the penetration of e-readers has reached 17% by the end of 2012. That's actually it's actually carried out by Nielsen Mobile, so it's within mobile phone owners, although that obviously is a very large majority of any kind of population in any sort of first world country. Tablets up to 20% by the end of 2012. Looking at how that breaks down to the major brands, tablets led by iPad, as I'm sure everyone would have anticipated. In terms of e-readers, the combined total of the various Amazon Kindle brands on the right-hand side here is 58%, so quite dominant in the e-reader market, as we might expect. Barnes & Noble, their combined total is 26%, so there is a kind of valid competitor there, but Amazon's still really leading the way. Looking at the age demographics of tablet ownership and e-reader ownership, we see a slight variation there in the kind of key demographics that are buying those and using those devices. So tablet ownership tends to skew slightly younger, with the kind of under 44 age groups taking the majority, whereas the e-reader device owners, the majority is 45 and over. So over 50% of e-readers in the US are owned by the 44 and over age bracket. But if we look at the difference between Q3 and Q4, you can see that the youngest brackets in both tablets and e-readers are actually now growing. So the market is kind of broadening its appeal. Essentially, I think the fact that these are now very much mainstream devices and that there are various versions of tablets and e-readers that are very affordable means that it is open to teenagers, and younger people are also now buying these devices. We can also look at the gender split in terms of tablet owners and e-reader owners. And we can see that tablet ownership is relatively evenly split between male and female in the US, but we can see that it skews quite strongly on the female side for e-reader owners. So in the US, we're looking at a 45 and over, slightly more predominantly female ownership of e-readers, which from research we've seen, certainly from the UK previously, older women are often the heaviest book buyers and make up the biggest proportion of the book buying population. Moving on to look at the actual usage of those devices and what kind of functions people are carrying out on them. Obviously, on the right-hand side, it's obvious that e-readers are going to be dominated by people reading books. But it's quite interesting that looking at tablets, tablet usage, the people reading books, that's the third most reported activity in the US of owners of tablets after social media and news. That books is the third most frequently accessed application on a tablet. Okay, of the people in the US reporting that they accessed book content through either their tablet or their e-reader, and asked which media outlets they regularly accessed, again we see dominance from Amazon there right at the top with about 70%, Barnes & Noble with 27%, and then other much smaller players further down. We're going to move on now and look a little bit at similar figures for Italy. So by the end of 2012, e-reader penetration in Italy had reached 3%. So in terms of in comparison to the US, quite a long way back on the curve of e-readers penetrating the market. And also a big difference in the demographic, that it's actually where in the US we saw it almost 60-40 favouring the female population. In Italy, it's actually skewed towards the male population. And again, if we look at the similar splits in terms of the age demographics, in the US it was the 45s and over and women. In Italy, it tends to be the younger age brackets, and the sort of 25 to 44 is the majority of the owners of e-readers currently. Looking at the breakdown of brands, the Kindle models lead the way with almost 40% of the market, so not as dominant as in the US, but the next biggest player with the Sony reader at under 10%. So Amazon not as dominant, but the sort of second place player not as large yet within the market. Okay, so we're going to move on to look at the UK ebook market. As I mentioned earlier, because we don't have a broad measure of ebooks through data directly from the retailers, we're using consumer data to give us an insight into how the market's developing. So the data that we're using is, we're actually partnering with Kantar World Panel, who have a panel of around about 15,000 consumers who provide data regularly on all their purchasing habits. So it covers everything they buy, but obviously it covers books and ebooks as well. This kind of data tends to be very good for looking at trends and averages and proportions. It's not measuring the whole market, but as a sample, it should give us a very good picture of how the market's developing. So first of all, just looking at how the market penetration of ebooks has developed in the UK, you can see that it's been a steady rise throughout the last couple of years. And the question asked here of consumers is basically if they've ever bought an ebook. So this is the number of people who've ever bought an ebook. And by the end of 2012, that had reached over 16% of the UK market. That was approximately double what it had been, well, it's more than double what it had been the year before. So as you can see, that the growth has been very quick there. Approximately 370,000 new ebook customers are coming into the market in the UK every month. But what's quite interesting is that, as well as another question which is often asked is whether people who are buying ebooks are simply stopping buying books. Is it the same market that's transferring from one group of people to the other? Now, in the UK, and based on this data, we've actually seen that the total penetration of books in any format has actually increased. So at the start of 2012, before 2012, the market penetration of books in any format was round about 79%. But with ebooks actually bringing new readers and new buyers into the market, it's up to about 83%. So a positive fact there is that the e-readers and the new technology is broadening the access of books in general. Okay, there's quite a lot of information on this graph here. The red bars show the sort of year-on-year change in terms of the penetration, so that we can see, going back to the start of January 2012, comparing that to the year to January 2011, massive growth, over 500%. That's starting from a very low point, so it obviously appears that there's exponential growth going on. As we can see, that slows really quite rapidly, and already we're seeing that the growth we're seeing each month is levelling off. So it seems like we've probably moved through the very fast exponential period of change, and we're now levelling out where the change will continue, but it's not going to be at that same rapid growth we've seen before. The orange and blue lines give the total cumulative value sales of ebooks in the UK market, with the blue line at the top being sales for 2012. The same as penetration has more than doubled, actual value sales more than doubled in 2012, ending up at around about £150 million in the UK market. But again, if you look at the very end of the blue line, the last couple of months we're levelling off. So from being a very steep upwards curve, we are sort of levelling off and getting through that period of very rapid change. In terms of how that breaks down as a proportion of the market, this initially is showing volume sales. And you can see within the fiction market, again, this may be something that we all assume, but we've actually got some data to look at it. It's 27% that ebooks are now taking up of the UK fiction market. In children's and non-fiction, much, much lower. If we look at the same thing but looking at value sales, so the proportion of the market that ebook revenue makes up, we can see that those proportions are much lower, so that fiction was 27% in volume, less than 17% in value. And again, non-fiction and children's are significantly lower than the fiction market. Looking again specifically at the UK fiction market over the last couple of years, just looking at physical books initially, we can see that there's been a decline there of around about 15%. If we then add in the ebooks to those sales, and again this is volume sales, we can see that there's a fair proportion in 2011 and a much larger proportion in 2012, which actually makes the overall fiction market in slight growth in the UK by about 2.5%. But if we look at the same thing based on value and the revenue that has been delivered by ebooks, we see a similar decline year on year in physical books. Adding on the ebooks, though, we can see that there's been a decline. So despite the fact that ebooks have increased the volume sales and broadened the access of books, it hasn't led to revenue growth in the fiction sector, which is the sector which has most migrated to ebooks so far. And another kind of graphic to follow that up is the average selling price that we've measured for both physical books and ebooks. The physical book price has been very, very constant, around about £6.50, whereas the price of an ebook has actually drifted down from around about £4, and it's drifted down, so it's now actually, by the end of 2012, was less than half the price of a physical book. So not only have ebooks consistently been cheaper than physical books, the price is being driven down as we move along through the market developing. To summarise what I've said so far, print book markets continue to see decline. The ebook sales data from the major ebook retailers is not broadly available to us, so consumer data is helping to give us some indications of where the market's going. We saw that in the US, e-reader adoption was skewed towards an older and female demographic, whereas in Italy, the adoption rates are stronger among a younger and male demographic. We saw that in the UK, the ebooks have taken on a significant proportion of the fiction market in particular, but that's not matched by revenue growth. And we also saw that the non-fiction and children's sectors within the UK have not grown as strongly in ebooks as fiction has. And that final point that I was just making, that the ebook pricing is not only lower than physical books, but has been driven down over the last year as market penetration has increased. And based on what we've looked at and the data that we've seen from this consumer research, a couple of key challenges that we might point out would be how publishers can maintain and grow their revenue as the migration to digital books continues and brings a new pressure to deliver low prices. And also how publishers and content providers can develop compelling digital content for the non-fiction and children's sectors. And that's all for me today. Thank you very much.